And I'll ask you to open your imaginations with me this morning. And imagine it was another rainy day. The roof of his small apartment fought against the persistent drops of water, but the invading raindrops were too much for the old roof to handle. The buckets and pots were placed in their usual locations to catch the water that made it through, but he wasn't worried about his roof at that moment, as he grabbed his raincoat and his Bible, and he headed for the corner where he would meet the band. As he arrived, the band was playing, and when they finished the final chorus of "O Boundless Salvation," the big bass drum was laid on its side on the cobblestone street. He stepped forward to tell those who had braved the weather about the good news of salvation through Jesus Christ. But just as he was about to begin, he paused. The sound of the raindrops hitting the bass drum brought back a memory to his mind of a similar night about 5 years ago now. That night was a lot like this one. It was pouring down rain. The band had laid the big bass drum on its side as the tall, thin man with the flowing white beard began to speak. But on that night, he wasn't carrying his Bible. No, on that night, he was carrying a bat. On that night, he was the owner of a pub. And he had heard about this band that came to town, blowing their horns and beating their drums, and of the tall, thin man with the white beard preaching Jesus and kidnapping all the faithful drinkers from their bar stools. He had heard that after this band came to town, and that tall, thin man with the white beard got done preaching, all the pubs in town sat empty. No ale being pulled, no whiskey being poured, no money being made. And he was not going to let that happen to his pub. So he decided he was going to put a stop to that band and that man on that rainy night. It was nearly 5 years ago now. But something happened to him when that tall, thin man with the white beard began to preach. And suddenly, he heard for the first time the message of God's love for him, and he felt compelled to respond. He was so overcome by the power of the gospel that night that he walked slowly up to that big bass drum with that bat in his hand. He had planned to raise that bat over his head and bring it down with a loud boom that would break the drum head. But instead, he heard clunk, clunk, clunk as that bat hit the cobblestone street. And his knees bent and his elbows hit that bass drum, but it wasn't the drum head that broke. It was him. That was the night, nearly 5 years ago now, that he gave his life to Jesus Christ. And this night, instead of fighting against the band and the man that he was so determined to defeat for the sake of his precious pub, he was leading that band, and he was the man, determined to defeat sin. So as he prepared to proclaim the gospel, he looked out over the crowd and he met the gaze of a man standing with rain dripping off the bat in his hand. And he began to proclaim the gospel boldly. Let me ask you a question. What are you zealous for? You know the word zealous, you know what that means. To be zealous, to be radical, to be determined, on fire for something. What are you zealous for? Are you zealous for fishing? Are you zealous for for cars and hot rods? Are you zealous for football? This is Alabama, right?
That's right.
Roll Tide.
That's right.
What are you zealous for? Oh, bless your war eagle. We can get pretty radical, pretty zealous about things, can't we?
That's right.
In Acts, the 9th chapter, that portion that Larry read for us, Acts chapter 9 is talking about this guy named Saul. And Saul was a pretty zealous individual. He was a pretty radical dude. He was traveling around, what our Bible tells us, he was persecuting the Christians. But if you read Acts chapter 9 and you understand where Saul is coming from, see, in verses 1 and 2, we read that Saul is very zealous. He is dedicated. He is hardcore about something he believed very strongly in. See, Saul believed very strongly in the God of the Torah, the God of the Old Testament, the God that he had been taught from the time he was a little child. And he grew up knowing this powerful, incredible God. And in his mind, this Jesus character had come in and was kind of pulling people away from his God. And so Paul was really just trying to protect God. He was standing up against what he thought was a threat to his Lord. And so as he goes into Damascus, on his way with the letter saying, I'm going to arrest anybody who's following Jesus in this place, he's doing it with good intention. See, he thinks he's protecting God. Unfortunately, Saul was wrong. See, Saul thought he was doing something right, but he was wrong. You ever done something you thought was right and found out later it was wrong? Our best friends just had their third baby last week. They now have Kailani, who's 5. Josiah is 2. And Ezekiel was born a week ago today. And it's interesting, Carla tells us that from the time Kailani was born to the time Ezekiel was born, the doctors are telling her, well, we don't do it that way anymore. Now you want to do it this way. The things that we told you about raising your kid 5 years ago, no, that's wrong. We do it this way now. If you don't believe me, let me ask you this. What is, if you burn yourself, what do you do for a burn? Run it under cold water. Run under cold water? Okay. Raise your hand if your mother ever put butter on your burn. Okay? All right? Because that's what you did. If you got burned, you put butter on it. Right? Or what did mom do if you got a bloody nose?
Tilt your head back.
Tilt your head back, right? Okay, tilt your head back when you got a bloody nose, okay? But, we don't do that anymore. No, they figured out, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. But we tell parents things, this is how you should care for your child. And they love that child. And they want to protect that child. So they do what they think is right. And unfortunately, sometimes we find out it's not right anymore. Anybody remember Dr. Spock? Okay, not the Star Trek guy. He wrote a bunch of books about child development, and then now it's like all that stuff's out the window. But it was the big thing back then. But then we find out, no, that's wrong. And sometimes we do that. Sometimes we do things that we think are right. But then we find out they're wrong. And we can be zealous about doing things that we think are right. This is the way it ought to be. And by golly, no one's going to stand in my way. But then sometimes we find out that's not right.